March 1945, somewhere in France. A German reconnaissance pilot banks his aircraft over the tree line and photographs what he sees below. Tanks, trucks, artillery, the unmistakable signature of a large American armored force dug in and waiting. He doesn't know he's photographing air. Every vehicle in that field is inflatable. Every one of them was unfolded from a kit bag, pumped up with a compressor, and positioned by men who, until recently, were painting in art schools in New York and Philadelphia. The army he just photographed doesn't exist, and 10 miles away, the real one is moving. I've read a lot of war history. I don't think I've ever come across a unit quite like this one. 1,100 men, inflatable tanks, record players, and enough nerve to sit in French cafes pretending to be soldiers from units that were somewhere else entirely. They saved an estimated 15,000 to 30,000 American lives. Their story was classified for 50 years. Most people have never heard of them. The Germans saw exactly what they were meant to see. That was the whole point. To understand why the United States Army built a fake one, you need to understand the problem. Moving a large military force is loud, obvious, visible. Columns of tanks throw up dust clouds visible for miles. Radio traffic multiplies. Supply convoys clog roads. Enemy aerial reconnaissance, and the Germans were good at it, could read the shape of an Allied advance from photographs taken at altitude. The Allies needed to move armies without the enemy knowing where they were going. They needed the Germans watching the wrong place at the wrong time. The solution wasn't better camouflage. It was theater. In January 1944, the United States Army activated the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. On paper, it looked like a standard headquarters unit. In reality, it was something that had never existed before in American military history. A mobile, multimedia battlefield deception force designed to simulate 2 entire divisions, roughly 30,000 men, using methods that had more in common with a film production than a military campaign. The men recruited to fill it were not typical soldiers. The visual deception unit drew heavily from art schools in New York and Philadelphia. The Army was looking for people who understood how things looked, how a tank park reads from above, how shadows fall, how the overall impression of a large force is constructed. What they got was a cohort of young artists who would spend the war staging scenes for an audience that could never know the show was fake. Bill Blass would become one of America's most celebrated fashion designers. Ellsworth Kelly would become one of the most significant painters of the 20th century. Art Kane would become a legendary photographer. In 1944, they were inflating rubber tanks in French fields. The unit had one of the highest average IQs in the entire United States Army. Captain Fred Fox, who wrote the official history of the 23rd, described them as a theatrical company. The German army was their audience. His words, not mine. We must remember that we are playing to a very critical and attentive radio, ground, and aerial audience. They must all be convinced. If you're finding this interesting and you want more, subscribe. New episodes every week, and every single subscriber genuinely helps. Now, how do you actually build a fake army? There were 4 layers. Each one had to work independently. Together, they had to be seamless. The first was visual. The unit had a fleet of inflatable vehicles, tanks modeled on the M4 Sherman, trucks, artillery pieces, jeeps, even aircraft. Each one deflated into a kit bag small enough to carry. Each one inflated with a compressor in under an hour. The trick wasn't making them look perfect up close. It was making them look convincing from aerial reconnaissance altitude. So the men would position them with the spacing of a real armored unit, and then camouflage them, deliberately imperfectly. Real units try to hide their vehicles. A unit trying to be seen hides them just badly enough that the camera catches them. That's a very specific kind of genius. The art wasn't in the objects, it was in the staging, knowing how a real tank commander would conceal his tanks, and replicating that imperfection at scale. Painters and designers thinking like military commanders, creating scenes that would be read by people they'd never meet, from aircraft they'd never see. The second layer was sonic. A unit within the 23rd had gone to Fort Knox before deployment and recorded the sounds of armored units on the move. Tanks starting up, columns advancing, bridge construction, engineers assembling. These recordings were pressed onto discs and played through powerful amplifiers mounted on half-tracks, audible 15 miles away. For each deception, operators mixed the recordings to match whatever scenario they needed the enemy to believe. An armored column arriving, a force digging in, engineers preparing a river crossing. The third layer was radio. The 23rd had signals operators who had studied the individual Morse code style of operators from real American units. Every operator has a slightly different rhythm when sending Morse. Intelligence services on both sides knew this and used it to track unit movements. The Ghost Army's spoof operators could impersonate specific individuals convincingly enough that German signals intelligence couldn't detect the switch. While the real unit moved, the fake radio traffic stayed behind, chatting away in a voice the Germans recognized. The fourth layer is the strangest one. Men from the unit would go into local towns wearing the shoulder patch of whatever division they were impersonating. They'd sit at bars, talk to locals, let slip the kinds of operational details that might reach German intelligence. Unit gossip, references to commanders, complaints about the food. They were performing a role in occupied France, in towns where spies might be listening. If any of them had been identified as imposters, the likely outcome was execution. That last part doesn't get mentioned enough. These men weren't safe behind the lines. They were sitting in cafes in enemy-adjacent territory, doing improv theater with their lives as the stakes. Put all four layers together, and you get something that doesn't just look like an army, it feels like one. Now, the climax. March 1945, the Rhine crossing. The U.S. Ninth Army needed to cross the Rhine into Germany. The crossing was planned at a specific location. If the Germans concentrated their defenses there, the casualties would be devastating. The Ghost Army was given its most ambitious mission yet: convince the Germans that the crossing was coming 10 miles to the south. They inflated more than 600 dummy vehicles. Sound trucks ran through the night, blasting recordings of engineers building pontoon bridges. Spoof radio operators created traffic that placed a massive armored force at the false crossing point. Men in the right insignia circulated in nearby towns. The Germans looked south. The real crossing went in to the north. The Ninth Army crossed the Rhine with almost no resistance. The official history called it, fortunately, the 23rd's best. 15,000 to 30,000 American soldiers crossed one of Europe's major rivers in the final months of the war with minimal casualties. Because 1,100 men with air compressors and record players had convinced the enemy to look the wrong way. I've sat with that number, 15,000 to 30,000, for a while now. That's not a footnote. That's a city's worth of people who came home because a unit of artists staged the right scene at the right moment and nobody caught them at it. The 23rd returned to the United States in July 1945. They were told to keep quiet. No medals, no public acknowledgement. The classified nature of their methods meant the deception capabilities they'd developed couldn't be recognized without revealing how they worked. So the men went home. Blass went back to fashion. Kelly went back to painting. For decades, when people asked what they'd done in the war, most said very little. Some said nothing at all. The unit was declassified in 1996. A PBS documentary followed in 2013. In February 2022, President Biden signed the Ghost Army Congressional Gold Medal Act. The surviving members, most of them in their 90s, finally received official recognition for operations that had ended 77 years earlier. Some had died waiting. The war they helped win was remembered for the beaches, the generals, the speeches. The traveling roadshow that moved through France and into Germany, that stayed secret. The Germans saw the tanks. Nobody saw the men pumping them up. If you made it here, thank you. Seriously. This channel is built on stories that didn't make it into the official version of history, and finding people who care about that is the whole point. If you want more of this, Subscribe and leave a comment. Tell me something hidden you think deserves an episode. I read all of them. See you next time.